All right, Ivor Cummins, thanks for joining me again.
Great stuff, Brian. Good to see you again.
Yeah, well, we saw each other in Denver recently, and we did a podcast about a year and a half ago. So if anyone wants to go back, they can find that one on Peak Human. But there's so much more to talk to you about. We talked a lot of cholesterol stuff, but you dive into way more. You have a great podcast yourself, great YouTube channel. Learned a lot from your guests, and it's awesome, awesome stuff. And you've been talking about coronavirus and looking at a lot of data. You've been talking about a lot of vitamin D, which I'm super into right now. And I watched your presentation a year ago, and I keep bringing it up. D is for debacle. Check it out on YouTube. But let's dive into it because I know not everyone's going to check it out, and you probably have a lot of new data since then about vitamin D and how important it is to your immune system. So go for it. Let's do it.
Yeah, well, you know what, Brian? Yeah, thanks for that. But we could share the slides from the pod I did because that kind of shows you visually as well as me talking about it. You know, you can see the latest data for this current issue and how important vitamin D might be in it. Maybe will I do that?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's share the slides. So I usually do audio only podcasts, but anyone listening, go to YouTube and go to the Food Lies YouTube and, go to Ivor's YouTube as well. And let's take a look at this stuff because, yeah, it is very visual.
Yeah, and the verbal will probably work, but yeah, the visuals are a lot better. So here I'm just showing the first study that came out a couple of weeks ago. And, it's a small study. It's a couple of hundred people, but it was quite fair. And what I liked about it was they just looked at people who came in with corona. There was no real selection bias. And the other good thing was they measured the D in the people, their status, 2 months to a year before they were admitted and post-admittance. And they verified that it didn't change much. So it wasn't like the D was low because they got coronavirus infection, because some things like
Yeah.
ferritin and other things are acute phase reactants, we call them, CRP, that when you get the problem, they change. So you don't know what the person was beforehand. But here it was good. They checked back over a year. So this study anyway showed, and it's quite dramatic, that the mild cases were absolutely dominated by people over 30 nanograms. And just for units, over 30 is over 75 nanomoles. They're more European, I think. So the people over 35 or over 30 nanogram had vastly more mild cases. In fact, nearly the whole of the mild segment of all the people is all people over 30. And then as you go to ordinary, severe, or critical challenges with this infection, you see more and more of the bars are dominated by people below 30 or particularly below 20. So it just kind of shows, wow, people who are above 30 naturally for some reason are getting away with murder with this infection. Okay. And it's associational. So let's be fair, it's an association, not causal. But there's another graph here showing the same thing, really, that pretty much on average, the people who had a mild outcome were around an average of 33 nanogram. And the people who had a critical outcome were an average of 19 or so. And the other point about this is we know that Black and ethnic minorities in many countries are seeing way more impact from this. And one thing common that they would have is very poor vitamin D status because of their skin tone, and they're in northern latitudes where they're not going to get as much. So that's an interesting point. But the next, and there's only one other thing being shown on screen. A lot of tweets from doctors who are basically saying, we're not seeing anyone in our clinics with corona with severe cases who are above 40, and even almost none above 30. So that's just anecdotal. But the
I'll stop
second,
for a second.
oh yeah,
Sorry, quick second. So I posted some of these graphs on Instagram, so you can check there. And also, I have a business partner. I work with Dr. Gary. People coming into his clinic with COVID, they're in the teens for their vitamin D levels. So he's
yeah,
testing them all, and he's never seen anyone with a high vitamin D level. So more anecdotes there.
yeah, true. But the lucky thing is we have 4 published studies now all saying the same thing. And this is the second one. I'm just showing the baseline data. But this one was 780 people. So the first was Philippines, A doctor there, a radiologist, did the study. And this one's a team of doctors. And they got 780 cases, which is substantial. And they looked at mortality from corona, which is, the ultimate measure. So I'll move on from the baseline data and the univariate analysis. So the first pass analysis was just what was the outcome like, the risk of death from corona, if you're above 30, 21 to 29, or below 20. And what they saw just with a quick look was that if you're insufficient, as in between 20 and 30, you had 12.5 times the risk of death. Now that's a big multiplier, okay? And if you're below 20, hey, you had a 19 times the risk of death, relatively associational. So these are huge risk multipliers. These are like nothing you'll ever see except smoking and lung cancer. And to give people an idea, a risk ratio which they used to decide that meat might cause cancer and published worldwide on that was around 1.15. So these risk ratios for low vitamin D status and corona, poor outcome and death, they're orders of magnitude bigger. So if it's below 2, a risk ratio of 2, you can nearly ignore it. If it's above 5, you seriously got to explain it. And if it's above 10, you're into the smoking and lung cancer category. So the beauty this team, which the other team didn't do, was this team did multivariate regression. And just to explain to people, what you do is you correct for all of the confounders you can think of, or the big ones, and you back out the confounding. It's never perfect, but here we know that older people tend to have lower vitamin D. They stay out of the sun, their skin doesn't generate it as well. Many are on crap diets, so they're not getting it. So we know that some of this association may be because older people get corona problems and older people have lower D. So maybe it's the age. But the beauty is this team corrected for the age and the sex and comorbidities. That's a lot of correction, And what they saw was, sure enough, the ratios dropped, but the reality was insufficient was still 7.6 times more likely to die, and deficient was still over 10 times more likely to die, even after correcting for all those things. So this means you've got what should happen is you have a massive task force should be set up worldwide to go after this, because you're talking a 10 times risk ratio. And what we're seeing is, of course, is nothing is happening. And this is one of the tragedies.
Nothing. And no one's talking about people's health status in general, right? Obesity,
Yeah.
chronic disease, much less vitamin D. And part of the problem is I was just talking to some people just that I know that don't know anything about nutrition, and they just think vitamin D, it's like, oh, what is this? Take some vitamin C tablets, or, they just think it's hokey. They don't get it. They don't, we're trying to say this is not just a vitamin, it's a pre-hormone, or it's a totally different ballgame. So I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And there has been a long effort to discredit vitamins, minerals, all of these things, because they're kind of a competitive threat to the patented massive medicines business. So I think we've seen for many decades now a continued push against not just vitamins or pre-hormones like D, but also against minerals like magnesium and potassium and selenium. I mean, all these crucial things for the human machine to operate properly, to have a proper immune system, they've always been pushed against like they're woo. So I'd agree, Brian, it's kind of crazy. But I went through, and it might help people who can see the video, but I'll verbalize it. So really we want to know, correlation isn't causation, but these correlations are so enormous, they approach causation on their own, but they're still not causation. So I put together, what makes up this person who's over 30 nanograms who has 10 times less risk, rough and tough? And what makes up the person who's below 20, who has 10 times more risk? It's not just whether they took supplements, there's much more to it. So the first thing I said was, well, a person over 30 will tend to have eaten meat, fish, eggs, D-rich, good, natural, wholesome, evolutionary foods. So that's not just a D factor. We know from previously published work that if someone has a lowish D status and they switch to a low carb, real foods, a healthy diet, even not focusing on D, their D status can go right up, even without taking any supplements. So, you know, there's other reasons for D being low besides not getting enough sun and supplements. So people like this who are in the low risk group will tend to be people who eat real food. Also, people who do not have insulin resistance. So if you have insulin resistance, your D status drops. So D is a great marker. If it's high, you're very unlikely to have insulin resistance and metabolic disease. So that's another thing for high D people. Inflammation. So autoimmune and inflammatory chronic conditions will drive down your D status. You know, it's not fully decoded, but we know it's a fact. So people who have low inflammation, low oxidative stress, no autoimmune problems will tend to be in the good group, right? Then we've got sun. So healthy sun exposure brings much more than D. It brings nitric oxide, which is really important for arterial health. And also nitric oxide is, it appears, very important for corona too. So there's papers coming out on that. So the above 30 person will tend to have had healthy sun exposure, which gives a whole range of immune boosting and general health boosting effects. And the science is published. And finally, yes, a person over 30 may have got there partially by taking supplements. But it's important to say supplements are one of 5 things, and the other 4 are likely much more important in deciding you're a high D person that will likely be at very low risk. So that's kind of the summary of what is the distinction between the high and low D person. It's not just D value. It's all the things that got them there and made them way healthier and way more ancestral, right?
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
So yeah, so just to continue, the D is for debacle lecture. I go through this in huge detail. I just have a screenshot there on the screen, 2014 YouTube. And then I went on to human evolutionary environment. So just focusing a little more on the sun. And I'm showing here the UV flux across the latitudes. And of course, we've got high UV a lot of the year all around the equator. And but as you go north, you know, into Europe and North America, you only get it a few months in the summer. So our skin lightened as we migrated to enable us to get vitamin D, and we didn't need the protection of the pigmentation. So a lot of us are in the regions of the world where we kind of evolved to be in, and some of us are not because of modern travel and migration. So it is interesting, and I noted it in the first lecture, that Australia and New Zealand, which are seeing at the moment incredibly low impacts from corona. They're so low, they're almost like ridiculous. And it's not because of their lockdown, because, you know, Southern Australia, I have it on good authority, is not that locked down at all, really, you know. So they've somehow dodged a bullet. But what people are not talking about is coronaviruses have a long and well-studied history, and they are always in the northern and southern hemisphere that have summer winter seasons. They always come up in winter seasons with a surge, and they always go down in summer. Now, it just so happens that Australia and New Zealand, this is not a proof, but they just happen to have come out at the end of an extremely hot summer. I was in New Zealand in late November. It was boiling. I got a little pinked. So the history of coronavirus research would suggest, well, a country coming out of a long hot summer in the southern hemisphere, you wouldn't expect any real major corona impact. And as it happens, that's what we see. In Northern Europe, which is coming out of a long, hard winter, we're seeing much stronger patterns of enormous viral impacts. And even within America, we're seeing New York, a dense city, high north latitude, enormous impacts, tragically. But they have a viral load and a density, and they ran their subways as this thing ramped. So there's other factors. But Florida down south is not locking down overly hard. But Florida is seeing incredibly low rates. And Florida is a very old state, much older than New York. The people there are much more aged. So it should be hammered. But California and Florida, and generally in southern areas, you're not seeing near the impact. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. And I only wish, Brian, that the scientific community was talking about it. Not that this is all correct, but the fact that no one is investigating, discussing, is incredible from an engineering mind. Because an engineering mind in a crisis, when you're managing it, the first thing you do is you look for the root cause of the impacts. Here it's a virus, but that's not really it, because the virus, yes, is there, but we know there's massive differences in impact. So they're the root causes of high impact. That's the big thing. Second thing is mitigation in engineering crises. So you want something to mitigate the problem while you get things sorted. And that would be like in this one, medications, they'll mitigate. And the third thing is containment, which you need to protect the customer from problematic parts. But here, it's like everything is containment. That's the only discussion, the containment vector. So it's nothing like engineering crisis management, where we'd be all over the cause of the impacts primarily, with a team working on containment on the side. At least that's how I always ran them. So yeah, what do you reckon the latitude?
Well, that's super important. You know, I'm a mechanical engineer. You know, you've done more engineering in your life than me because I kind of got out of it. But I just talked to some friends from Hawaii, and they're not getting a lot of it. They are getting one case a day, and they're doing fine. They weren't even like, they had tons of tourists from Asia in there in March, and still didn't get it. And they were allowed to surf. My friend was still allowed to go surfing. You know, people are getting out there. They're not getting it. Just another interesting correlation. So let's keep going here.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think we're broadly seeing this correlation all over the place and very consistent. But that said, there are going to be exceptions. And people are talking about the equatorial countries like Brazil, but they're a little different. To look at this and look at correlations, you need to be North Hemisphere with seasons or Southern. If you get into the equator, there's UV all year round, but some cultures cover up. So they have very low vitamin D status in spite of high UV. So you can't just look at UV in an area. You know, it's a little more nuanced. But when you take the nuances into account, you begin to see very strong patterns, like you referred to there as well, and I referred to. So for people on vitamin D, I'm showing a Maasai kind of tribesman here, a strikingly handsome and incredibly healthy man, if I may say so. And he's in traditional dress. And of course, he's out in the sun and dressed appropriate for the warm weather they have there all the time. And the Maasai have been studied, and their average vitamin D is around 42 nanogram. And that's the evolutionary human norm, pretty much. And the Bantu, this paper looked into, who are genetically pretty much the same, pretty much, they live in the cities and they're modernized, and their average vitamin D is 26, right? So that's below the 30. And they put it down to poor diet and lack of sun exposure and culturally being dressed. So, I mean, for what it's worth, evolutionary here is 42, even for black-skinned people, because they're in high UV areas. So they still end up at 42. And the interesting thing is, Wyoming athletes I'm showing now, Caucasians, male, female, without supplementation, just healthy eating and running and training out in the sun in Wyoming, males average 42, women average 50, because there's slight sex differences. But there you see ancestral Caucasians out in the sun, even in the north, once it's the summer. So again and again, and just for a little bit of tech, Professor Hollick, who discovered vitamin D, I remember years ago, I found a paper from him, and they did rate limiting analysis. And what they discovered was, if you keep getting lots of sun, generally, the reactions that create the D, they tend to slow down when you get up to around 45. So yet again, from a biochemical perspective, we get this mid-40s figure. Even your coding in the reactions that create D, they naturally level off and relax when you get up to the mid-40s. Almost like you're at the mid-40s, you're in the zone, we don't need to push it higher. Though people can push it higher with supplements, that's the natural level. So evolutionary science here. So that's just a ground in people. 40s is great. Above 30 is required. And below 30, you're doing something wrong. And that's something wrong, and it can be many different things. That something wrong could cost you a lot during this crisis, or for all the other chronic diseases you might be prone to. So, and am I still audible? Yeah.
Yep. Sorry. I
Oh,
was just making sure I was recording.
oh right.
Keep
No,
going.
not to worry. You stop me whenever, Brian, now, because I have another
No,
slide.
this
And
is, keep going. This is great.
yeah, this one is really amazing. And I was very angry back in 2014 when I researched vitamin D, because personally, years before, when I hadn't got into any of this metabolic science, my son, who was only a year and a half old, became very, very ill and had to be brought to hospital, put on a drip, and he was just completely lackluster. He just had no energy, couldn't eat, couldn't drink. And we were very worried, really, really worried. And they put him on a drip, and they came back a few hours later with tests, and they said, oh, he's extremely low in vitamin D. You're going to have to take these drops and whatever. And I thought that was surprising. And I asked why, and I was dismissed. So we gave him the drops, he recovered, and everything was fine. But when I researched this years later in 14, I was furious. And the other reason I was furious is when I told my mother, she said, oh, yeah, you all got the D drops when you were young, when you were kids. Everyone had to get them. And I said, what? And she says, yeah, back when you were a kid, which would have been in the 70s, in Ireland anyway, all the mothers got the D drops. We were all told to, and we all gave them to you. So they actually dumped that procedure. They actually dumped a procedure. And then I go in with a critically ill son, and then they tell me he's profoundly deficient. So you can imagine how angry I was. So I was very angry when I gave that lecture, D debacle, and you probably heard in my voice. But one slide I had was an unfolding catastrophe, and I haven't changed the title. It's a bit dramatic. But what you'll see here is that 1988 to 94 period, NHANES in America tested the population. And generally speaking, you see here, it's worse as you get older, but around 40% of people were above 30 nanogram. And as they're older, it's a little lower. So 50% for younger people are above 30, and around 36% for older people. And when you look at races, Black people are way worse. Even back in 88 to 94, Black people, only 12% were above 30. So this is the racial thing. And Mexican American, not great either. But look what happened only a dozen years later when they went back to see, well, how are the population doing now? And I'm showing in red bars on the screen, they had halved. In only 12 years, the vitamin D status was half. And now you see only around 20% of people are above 30, which is obviously absurd because we showed the Maasai and the athletes, they're up at 45. This is crazy. So when you look then, I'll skip sex, and when you look at whites have halved in those few years, but Blacks have gone from only 12% are above 30 nanogram to less than 5% are now above 30 nanogram in 2001 to 2004. So people have to realize how profound the D deficiency problem is. It's enormous. It's just beyond belief nearly. And that's this slide. It is a catastrophe. Now, some of that is driven by poor food, by insulin resistance, and by chronic inflammatory conditions, which are caused by society. And they are driving the D lower. And some of it is because we were all told to be scared of the sun at all costs and wear sun cream. So that's another reason. But all these things are terribly bad things that we ended up doing. And the results are in this slide. It's a catastrophe.
This is so good because I didn't know how bad it was just changing from 20, 30 years ago. And so more people, I want to post this on Instagram as well and let everyone know. And yeah, I grew up in this era where we were scared of the sun. I grew up in Hawaii. Luckily, I did get a lot of vitamin D just naturally being outside. But I remember getting slathered up in sunscreen and just trying to avoid it like the plague. And we can get into sunscreen later. I don't know if you still have your slides on that, but there's a whole story there.
Yeah, it's crazy. I know that the cancer correlates with increasing use, but partly that's not that the sunscreen causes cancer. It's more that covering up with sunscreen means you lose the vitamin D and it makes you weaker. So, but yeah, but the sunscreen thing is kind of insane because people ask me, but what do you do then? And I say, okay, you wear light clothing if you're going to burn. Never burn. Get as much sun as you can without burning. Slight pink at most. And I don't think that's controversial. If you're going to be out longer and you can't help it, wear light clothing and a sun hat. Don't use sunscreen. Just use light
Cover
clothing
up.
like we did for
Yeah,
thousands
cover
of
up.
years. Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. If you're going to have to be in the sun to the point that you burn like a swimmer in a race, then use sunscreen and use one that's multi-spectrum that blocks all UV. You don't want to just block the UVB. You want to block everything. So use a total block from a reputable supplier. But that's only if you must be bare-skinned in the sun, like a competitive swimmer or whatever. So that's a simple rule. It's simple, you know. I'm just showing now another slide, vitamin D and the scientific calcium dogma, understanding the panacea of the sun. And that's a great 2012 paper, basically saying the sun brings so many health benefits. It basically controls so many hormones in your body. It's so central to the health of the human machine. And it kind of says we've made a massive own goal or kicked ourselves in the foot
Hmm.
by getting the idea that cancer, sun, it's a disaster. So it was just a good one. And I also showed the USA distribution. So below 30 nanogram now is over 70% of the US population. So at this stage, it's a joke. And if you had below 40 nanogram, which is my target, you're talking 85% are below the ancestral kind of norm. So that's where we are.
We need to get this message out there. Yeah, and then the diagram that we're looking at too from that study is just showing it's almost every system in the body. Every, pancreas, pituitary, thyroid, adrenal, gonads, kidneys, intestines, blood, bones, everything has a vitamin D component.
Yeah, it's so interconnected. And one reason, just from my lecture, very briefly, we came out of the sea around 350 million years ago. And in the sea, you can grab calcium anywhere and you can make the skeleton like all the sea creatures. But on land, it wasn't so easy. So diet became important and also vitamin D from the sun in order to get the vitamin D was central to the bone forming, as everyone knows. Magnesium is crucial. So you need to get your vitamin D, your magnesium, and potassium and other minerals. And bones are actually mostly protein matrix. Yeah, there's calcium in them for the solid aspect, but they're mostly protein. So a lot of osteoporosis is not so much not getting enough calcium. It's not getting enough magnesium, which is very important for bone processes, and not getting enough protein. So they made a huge mistake as well, just shoving calcium into older women who had bone issues. And they verified later that calcium supplements increased heart attacks. And they couldn't understand it. And the reason is it's not the calcium, and shoving in too much calcium is not natural. You should be shoving in magnesium, protein from animal sources, and a few other vitamins and minerals. And then your bone health is going to bounce back. But listen, you know better than anyone. They just hate vitamins and minerals. They just prefer drugs for osteoporosis, obviously, because why would you be interested in anything else? Only something that keeps the business going.
Yeah, part of it's that money component, but part of it is because we do the research poorly because we're isolating things and just giving them to people in the wrong context. Like you just said, you can't just give someone a bunch of calcium. You need to eat real foods, and there's a whole lot more going on. So it's a shame.
Exactly. And it's funny that integrative medicine is frowned upon because they're all vitamins, minerals, supplements, root cause, holistic. So it's kind of frowned upon. And the irony is, our most important role, and I used to hold it in many, many scenarios, was the integration engineer, the program integrator, technical integrator. And that person had to know good depth and breadth in all the technology areas that went into making complex products. and had to have an overview of how they interacted. So all the engineers in fluidics knew their stuff. In the IC integrated circuits, they knew their stuff. In the plastic parts, they knew their stuff. And I could go on and on and on and on. You have teams of engineers in high volume modern products on all the different technology aspects, doing their thing, doing a good job. But the whole thing falls apart when you have a complex issue because none of them really know the big picture. So that's where the technical integrator comes in, or I was the integration manager for over a decade. And I would have multiple technical integrators working for me and I'd overview them, but they integrated everything. Medicine has an enormous gap, and that's it. There's very few integrating. They're all in their own silos. It's a disaster, I think. And my own daughter's
So
doing medicine now, so she's seeing it.
that's great. Well, she'll be starting from the right spot and taking this broad approach from day one. But I just want to say real quick, this I feel like the people in like they'll say, "Oh, you're not a doctor. We're both engineers, but we're trying to do this job of overseeing everything." I'm not expert in anything. I'm just listening to all the great people and trying to integrate it and trying to communicate it and just look at the top level view. Right? That's what a lot of people in our world are doing. The good, they're synthesizing all this and trying to look at it from a top view.
Well, a case in point and a great example is, and I pushed it on Twitter and everywhere I could a couple of months ago, your talk at that food industry conference
Oh
was
yeah.
perfect because there's no point going into deep science and everything because the vast majority of people we need to influence, and even doctors, dare I say it, they need the logic and the big picture shown to them. So you crushed into 15 minutes there a compelling blow-by-blow logical case where animal foods are extremely healthy, and the idea that you should eat mostly plant foods is a choice. It's an ideological choice, but it's absurd to say it's healthy or healthier. And you didn't have to go into any crazy science and lose the audience. And everyone walked out of there probably thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to recheck what I believe from the media, right?
Yeah, a lot of people came up to me after, even though it was very plant-based, there was a lot of people, they're like, "Hey, we're on your side. Thank you. That was great."
Great
Yeah.
stuff. Well, I'm just showing that slide again that I showed earlier, and it just shows the 5 major things that lead to someone being ancestrally high in D and apparently enormously resistant to this current issue. And it's real food, D-rich, real meat, fish, and eggs, all the good stuff. Not having insulin resistance, which is related to real food, because if you eat just the real food, you're very unlikely to have a problem. Inflammatory conditions, not having those means you're going to be higher in D. And they relate to real food because if you eat real food, meat, fish, and eggs, and all that stuff, maybe some vegetables, you're very unlikely to have an inflammatory problem. We know where they come from. The sun, healthy sun, and then of course supplements. Look, if you're insufficient or deficient, no harm supercharging your recovery by supplementing. I would tend to use UV lamps or the sun in Ireland in the summer, and the food, because I think that's more directly driving the health than maybe just supplements. But
In the
supplements are
winter.
okay.
In the winter. Yeah, when there's no sun, yes.
Yeah, I mean, 4,000 IU a day is accepted for someone who's a bit low. The current recommendations of 600 or 800 is almost a waste of time. It's better than nothing, but the units are so tiny that, to give people an idea, in 20 minutes out in a pair of trunks in good sun, you'll make 20,000 units in 20 minutes easily. So obviously taking 800 or 600 is just a joke.
Yeah.
So four or 5,000 is broadly accepted, and there are bodies, professional bodies in the US now that Professor Hollick is in, and all the D researchers, and they all come around 4,000. And even the official guidelines say take 600 for an adult or 800, but they equally say it's fine to take up to 4,000, but they don't recommend it, which is a bit pathetic. So I asked the question here, if you did all this good stuff that we talked about and you got yourself into the above 30 club from say 19, and it'd probably take a couple of weeks, and you also got magnesium and all selenium, and all the other things that are correlating with
K2.
poor COVID outcomes.
Mhm.
The big question is, would you maybe start reducing your risk from a severe impact by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4? Would you start on your way to being 10 times safer?
Mhm.
And if you were, and the science says you should be, because your immune system's going to soar, you know, if you had problems and now you're fixing them, then this whole issue would look completely different. I mean, imagine everyone was over 30. Just looking at this data alone, if everyone was over 30 naturally, you might see 5, 6, 7 times less impact, and in that case, there would be no crisis. Bizarrely.
I've been saying this for day one. I personally am not scared of this at all. I've been exposing myself as much as I can. I've been hanging out with healthcare workers. I've been doing a lot of things that maybe I shouldn't be talking about, but
Mhm.
I am not scared. I don't get sick. There's these viruses, germs, whatever are going around. My immune system is good. They fly right past me. I do not care. I do not get sick. The only time that I've slightly got sick in 4 to 5 years is when I drove down my immune system by doing everything I could, by traveling and not sleeping and not getting in the sun, eating the wrong foods. I even had alcohol, drinking. It was just a mess. And then I got a tiny little bit. So was it because there was some crazy uh, coincidence of some virus that got me right at that moment? Or are they always there? And I just lowered my immune system. And that was the problem, not the virus. There's always viruses around. Why is no one talking about this?
Yeah, because everything is commercial, and the huge interest in this issue are two things. Well, many things. Politicians' fears, um, everyone's anxiety, in fairness, and everyone's worried. Obviously, there's big impacts. But also behind the scenes, there's an enormous excitement, I would say. And I know that sounds very harsh, but anyone in the business of medicine is going to be really racked up right now, because this is so big around the world in the media. There must be an enormous kind of, I don't know, energy in people thinking, wow, if we get a medication, wow, if we get a vaccine. And I think the publications on medications for corona in just a month or two have just shot through the roof. So I'm not being unfair to those people. It's just the way the business works. There is no interest in supplements or minerals. So the people who are not commercializing in this tough time, or will not be, um, they've just been programmed for 20 years that vitamins and minerals and supplements are woo. So they're lost,
Mhm.
the vast majority. And the ones who are involved and might know a bit more about this, well, they're not too interested, because unless it's patented or whatever, there's no market. So they shouldn't be interested, because it's not their business. Their business is selling patented things. So I think that's kind of just, it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way the world works. That's the
Mhm.
world we live in. And
Yep.
that's
That's how it works.
essentially, yeah.
And just say, and we're not, you did a very good job of, we're not pushing supplements at all. Obviously we make no money on supplements. We're pushing lifestyle, right? And so
Yeah.
obviously there's zero money in lifestyle. I mean, at least there's some money in supplements, and I can see why some people are, trying to, but we're like, hey, just go in the sun, get exercise, eat well. Come on.
Yeah, and Paleomedicina did a great little paper on this, and they got a bunch of people who had significant issues. They put them on as it happens, a keto, very animal-based diet, and they gave them no supplements. And quite dramatically, people down at low D levels went right up above 30 over a matter of weeks and months. And specifically, they were making the point that sun, diet, and fixing metabolic disease and dysregulation, your D value is going to go up. It's a master marker for that. You don't necessarily need supplements at all. And they also made the point that the Caucasians, or the Inuit who moved far north where they get very little sun, so they don't have supplements or sun. But hey, guess what? The only thing you can eat up there, and the reason they migrated up, was after the seals, the blubber, the fish. They didn't have any vegetables. So everything they ate up there comes with high D by default.
The
by
blubber,
default.
those fatty fish, that has some of the highest vitamin D, like the whale skin. I mean, this
Oh,
is something that no one really knows because no one eats whale blubber, but it is very high in vitamin D.
yeah, fish and dairy. Okay, but up there, fish, blubber, animal fat, where D is stored. There's a whole load of vitamin D to be accessed there, and that's so they got their D, even though they didn't really have sun. So here's one. It's a second pack, and it was a document came out from this Dr. Garrett Davies, Dr. Joanne Byers, Dr. Attila Garami, and it's a paper they released urgently for medical professionals around a month or two ago. And they just brought out a load of evidence. And I'll just read out a little of it, but it's stuff we'd be familiar with. Coronaviruses and influenza viruses in the past have displayed very strong seasonality with winter appearance. And I have many papers on this, including one that looked at 4 different coronaviruses. It's always the same, very seasonal. And the outbreaks are happening north of the 20 degrees latitude line. That's where we're getting all of our carnage right now. And deficiency occurs in winter because, yeah, you don't get the stuff. But then they interestingly, they showed Italy. Now, Italy, everyone knows Italy went down really hard, tragic. Now, overwhelmingly older people with conditions, but still massive problems a couple of months ago. And I didn't realize this, Brian. Italy has one of the worst vitamin D deficiency rates in all of Europe. And I'll quote from a couple of studies they quoted from. A study of Italian women aged 60 to 80, and that's the people who are dying, men and women, found values of vitamin D lower than 5 nanogram per mil in 27% of the women, and lower than 12 nanogram per mil in as many as 76% of the women. So in northern
Ouch.
Italy, yeah, over 3/4 have basement level below 12. Over 3/4. So it didn't say, but I'm guessing probably none of them were above 30. So, I mean, come on, we know from the studies below 30 is super shocking bad. And here we see Italy, people who are middle-aged and older are a disaster. And another study found 32% of healthy women, postmenopausal, and 82% of patients who are in neurological care homes were hypovitaminosis D, and that means below 12. So Italy is a disaster area, and it's probably cultural. As people go beyond middle age, they don't go out unclothed in the sun. They're North Italy with a lot of pollution, so the UV is blocked. And their diet has gone to hell over the last 30 years. So a whole lot of reasons. And they draw a contrast with Japan, and they say Japan is actually quite north, which doesn't have so much UV, but they do have better weather. But they noted that Japan's recovery rates are 7 times higher than deaths. And in the other Northern European territories, it's only 1-to-1 ratio. So Japan, and we know a month later now, Japan are amazingly getting away with murder, and they haven't even locked down. But they noted that Japan also has a strikingly low incidence of vitamin D deficiency versus Europe. And it's being put down to fish and culture. And prevalence of really low D in women over 30 years old in Japan is only 10%. And prevalence of vitamin D below 30, so this is below 30, which we saw in the study is 10 times the death, but 30 is a pretty good number. There were only 5% in active elderly in one study that were below 30. Now, elderly are generally low anyway, but one study of active elderly who are staying fit, eating good, only 5% were below 30. And in Italy, most of them are below 12. So, it's not proof, but I'm just showing now in Europe, vitamin D lower than 10, which is disaster, was found in between 2 to 30% of all adults in Europe, depending on the country, and up to 75% or more in older persons in institutions are below 10 across Europe. So we know 60% of the deaths for corona, Ireland, UK, Canada, 75%, I think, Italy, huge percentages. The care homes are contributing more than half of all deaths. And is it any wonder?
It's so crazy. So some people will say, don't get so obsessed with vitamin D. You guys are crazy about it. But it kind of doesn't, that doesn't make any sense to me, because we're not saying it's only vitamin D, because we keep stressing that it's other lifestyle factors, it's a chronic disease, it's
Yeah.
all these things. So maybe it is just a proxy. Maybe some of it is just a proxy for poor health. We don't care. It's all related. We're talking the vitamin D and the poor health and all this is related. So it's not like we're some wacky vitamin D people. It's just, you've done the research. You can watch all the, look at the full D's for debacle presentation and see all the studies. It's more than correlations. You show the mechanisms, you show all these different things. So just know that it's all tied together.
Yeah, exactly. And that point, you're right, Brian, can never be made enough. It's not just the magic D pill that you pop in your mouth. I mean, sure, that might help a lot for people who are insufficient. It'll supercharge their recovery, but it's really about the real food, the lack of insulin resistance or fixing it, fixing inflammatory issues, and so on and so forth, and getting healthy sun. That's really what it's about. So that's a key point. And here I'm just showing on the screen, this is corona impact. And of course, you can see it massively dominates in the Northern Hemisphere, who are just coming out of winter with everyone's D in the toilet. And we see that Australia and New Zealand just coming out of their summer, there's very little impact. And it ties together. So another thing, actually, interestingly, this team brought up is Brazilian experience with the SARS-1. So they actually noted that in SARS-1, back in 2009, there was maybe a 20 times higher incident rate of death for being right down from the equator, where there's lower sun, lower UV, lower vitamin D. Now, of course, this is confounded with diet, lifestyle down here, population density. But, there's quite a bit of population in other areas of Brazil. And you can see from the graph that there's a dramatic difference in SARS death per 100,000 rate, like almost a factor of 20, pretty much.
Well, and Rio is up there and they are doing fine. And that's probably the most population dense place.
Actually, I don't know the geography, but you're saying
Rio is up on the right, I think.
Yeah.
Around there.
And it's a big country. So actually when you go further down here, the D is really poor. It's like being really far north. So, I mean, every time you look, you see the correlations, I think is the point. And, it's just, look, it just should be on everyone's tongue of researchers and people working on this crisis should be prosecuting this aggressively. It should be one of the primary areas of focus in terms of mitigating the problem. But as we've seen, there's almost zero interest in anything but drugs or containment and lockdowns. That's the only interest. And the irony being that Australia and New Zealand, with their ridiculously low rates of impact, which no way, all of Europe, there's tons of people who've done lockdowns and all kinds of stuff. And the data that's emerging now is there's no fewer than 3 professors, including a Nobel Prize winner in the last 2 weeks from Oxford, Stanford, and Israel University, and myriad other mathematical analysts have analyzed the data for all the countries. And what they see is the distancing brought the R down to 1, or the replication rate in society. And the lockdowns, with no exception across the countries, the date of them, they appear to have not really affected the replication rate at all, the R number. So sadly, there's this obsession with lockdowns. They're probably offering very little extra over distancing, but they're getting all the credit. But, the interesting thing is, so all these professors have done the analysis, and I'd agree with their data, but the other side are ignoring them. And it's not like the other side who are pushing lockdowns like in a fever. It's not like they're analyzing the data and saying, no, we disagree. We've analyzed the data and we say the lockdown, look, it did do something. The other side are not doing any analysis. So it's not science. It's a belief-based system. They believe the lockdowns are good. They won't even look at their own data. But all the other professors of mathematics who look at it, and Carl Hennigan, Oxford University Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, he's the leader. 2 weeks ago, he said in the UK, our deaths peaked on the 8th of April. The infections peaked before that. The lockdown did not change anything beyond the distancing. It was too late. And it was in the Independent in the UK, a big newspaper, one day. And then it just disappeared because all the other media just blew over it. Lockdown fever.
It's so crazy. I haven't been vocal about this. It's become a very political issue. For some reason, people think that if you have to be one way if you believe in the lockdown, you're another way if you don't. But I've just been looking at the data. You've been looking at the data. You've had some other guests on. It's just sad that it didn't actually work out like we thought. I think it caused way more harm than good. We didn't look at all the unintended consequences. There's way more suicides. I just saw a study about way more suicides in Australia. I mean, it was more than that were actually saved by locking down, right? And economic costs. Do you have some of this data?
I do have, I can do, I don't have a pack to hand, but I'll show you something that really should help people. Honestly, I think this really helps. So we can talk about infection fatality rate, IFR, but that depends on how many people you tested. So you don't really know if the number is real. And case fatality rate, it depends on the cases came in and you're missing all the asymptomatics. So it's a poor number. What I like to use is all-cause mortality per head of population, because you cannot fudge that. That is reality. So in other words, when Corona has passed through, and maybe it's coming down now, the death rates in Europe are all coming down in the countries quite dramatically at the moment. And if they fade away, what you'll be left with is the number of people who died, and you'll have the number of people in Europe, and you'll know what the percentage fatality was, the real one. So I went and I got that. So I went to Euromomo, which shows the death in Europe per week out of 20 European countries for the last many years, and it graphs them. And it shows you when the death rate is higher than it should be. So say if suddenly there was, I don't know, nuclear explosion, you'd see it in Euromomo because a lot of people would die that normally wouldn't. So it's unbelievable data. And I'm going to show it here. It's all-cause mortality. So people will get a perspective. So I got an Excel file and I got the 20 countries where mortality is perfectly tracked in Euromomo. I got their populations. And then for Corona, I took from Worldometer, today, May the 9th, the actual figures for Corona deaths recorded. Now, these might be a little high because a lot of people have heard they're putting Corona on the death cert, even if they only suspect it. So I'm doing the worst case. These are the all Corona deaths. And when you divide the death for a country by the approximate population, you get the death per million. And that death per million I got agrees with Worldometer, which of course it would, because I got the deaths from Worldometer and I've got the populations, right? Can't fudge those. But what gets really interesting is, so when you calculate for today, to date, the Corona excess death rate is all Corona deaths in these European countries divided by the total population. And it's 0.033% is the actual death rate for Corona to date in Europe. Okay. But the 2018 kind of flu season excess death, I'll show in a moment, for the 17 or 18 weeks total was around 0.041%. So Corona has not yet reached 2018 season in terms of excess deaths, which may be interesting for people, you know?
Wow.
So this is real data. I'm going to leave this spreadsheet up here straight from Worldometer, which everyone's using, and from Euromomo, which is a top class, reputable. There's no fringe stuff here. Euromomo is running for years. It's used by all the governments. So I'm going to show you the little analysis I did. I'm going to move our faces to the left. So basically in 2018, I got 15 to 64-year-olds and 65 plus. You don't need to look at under 15. There's no spikes in the flu season, naturally. So if you integrate this graph, and all that means is every point or week that goes above the normal background, what it should be, you add that week and you add all the weeks together, around 19 of them here, and you've got the numbers of deaths here on the y-axis. So there's around 20,000 15 to 64-year-olds in 18 higher than the background normal death rate. And you'll see that every flu season, you know, you get a spike. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? There's some years you don't, but most you do. And I did the same for 65 plus year olds. And there's 140,000 of those died in 2018 over the 19 weeks of the winter. So in 2018, the excess deaths associated with that winter season or flu season was 160,000 people, which is 0.041% of the 430 million in the population. This is basic math. And for Corona, I didn't try and add up. You can see the Corona spike here, the
Mm-hmm.
spike. Euromomo shows the spike because it's very sudden and Corona is behaving like that. It's rising fast and then coming down, luckily, pretty quick too. So I used the Corona deaths from Worldometer, 100% legit, 145,077, 0.033% fatality. So right now, Corona has not reached the fatality of the season in 2018. But in fairness, it's continuing this problem. So it's gonna keep adding up. But I did a little graph to help. And what I said was, well, we know that Italy and Spain are later in their cycle. So you can see their death rates are coming right down. So you can imagine they're going to taper off and there's not going to be too many more, maybe 20, 30% more. We're
Mm-hmm.
guessing. We don't know the future. Other countries are more like here. So they might have another 60, 70, 80% more deaths because their curve is earlier. But either way, I depicted it like this. And I said, okay, let's look at it and see the data. 2018, you had around 1 million people die a week, during the flu season of 18 or 19 weeks. Around 1 million die anyway. People die. And I put the same for 2020. It's not finished yet, but that's just the baseline of people dying, 1 million roughly in this period. In 2018, in that period, 160,000 extra died. That's what Euromomo says. They're the figures. And we know so far in 2020, we've got an extra 145,000. And that's giving credit to all Corona deaths being everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flu seems to have disappeared anyway for some reason. So fair enough. So it's less. And I'm just showing it growing now. It might double or go up 2.5 times before we get into the summer. We don't know. But it looks from the curves that it'll probably double. It's hard to guess. And if it does, it will be much more severe than 2018. But it might be 2.5 times more, 2 times more. It's not like 10 times more, you know, just so people don't need to be maybe too panicky. Follow the rules, follow your government's guidelines, but maybe take a deep breath and put it in perspective. And when you look at the whole year of 2018, there's your 160K spread over the whole year. It adds to the year's normal deaths. And here's Corona so far, which is 145,000. And again, that may go up. We don't know. We'll find out. But again, it did. What do you think, Brian? It gives a sense of perspective of this, the size
Yeah.
of it. I think some people in their heads, this is growing into a chimera or an incredible, you know, scary monster. Very sad that mainly older people and people with conditions have died. Every death is a tragedy. I have elderly relations. I've been advising them. A lot of them have medical conditions. You know, I've got skin in the game all around me. My mother's down the road and she's nearly 80, right? So this is not being callous, but this is being data centric. We have to stop being emotional sometimes to think clearly and look at the data. Deep breath, focus on the data, understand the numbers, and then, you know, you are being rational and scientific. What do you reckon?
I think that's really important. And yeah, everyone knows the news cycle is this fear-based thing. It's always been that way. We know that. So just, I don't know why people don't understand that this whole thing is the same thing. And looking at it visually, it is not shocking. It puts it into good perspective. I hope people watch the YouTube version of this. And I think it's it's not some crazy conspiracy either, right? People think, oh my God, I saw a pandemic, or this is all crazy.
Oh,
No, we're
that's
not.
so, geez,
No, we're not
no.
saying that at all. This is there's
Yeah,
nothing to do with that. We're talking about, okay, I'm also not saying that we shouldn't have reacted and then a lockdown because we didn't know what we were dealing with, right? So in the beginning,
absolutely.
absolutely, right? Lockdown, we figured it out, but we were trying to flatten the curve, right? But no one talks about the fact that the area under the curve does not change. You flatten it to not overload the healthcare system. So it made sense, and absolutely, especially in New York. But once we figured out that we weren't overloaded, I talked to personal friends that I grew up with, not random people. I'm talking to my personal friend that I grew up with. She said she was in New York. Their hospital had tons of extra beds. At her certain hospital, it was in Manhattan. I mean, and she was very pro lockdown, pro everything, but she's like, well, truthfully, there's open beds. My personal good friend in Los Angeles, downtown area, plenty of open room, right? The whole time she was working the COVID units. She was doing all that. She's an ICU nurse. So it's great. We didn't overload the system. So why don't we correct and adjust? And people think, I think in the mainstream, that if you don't get coronavirus right now, you're never going to get it. Or I don't understand. Like it
Crazy.
still transmits through society. It's not just just because we lock down, we can't lock down forever.
Yep. I mean, SARS-1 is still around. I mean, swine flu still pops up. You can't really, okay, we eradicated smallpox, but without going into detail, it's a very special case. And we pretty much eradicated measles after decades and decades, but it's popping back. So you're right, there's no escaping this. And in fact, given the seasonality of coronaviruses, the problem would be if you don't get it now, I mean, next winter season, if they don't react to the D thing or whatever else makes the winter the only time when this blows up, then people are going to get it then. Now, Sweden is an interesting example. They have no lockdown and they got a lot of abuse for it. I've covered Sweden a lot and I feel sorry for them because their leadership team took the hard road. People say, oh, they don't care about the old people and they only care about the economy. It's not. They have a social contract. There is no corruption in government in Sweden. I know that's hard to believe, but I got it off a Swedish friend. There is no corruption in Sweden government. People just work away and they're doing a job and the Swedes are doing the job for Sweden. It's amazing. But anyway, they took a hard road and got abused for it to try and follow the evidence-based science on what viruses do. So far, they're in the middle of the pack of Europe in death rates, even though they admitted that they thought they could protect their care homes and they got hammered. They're not sure why. They thought they could stop it getting in there, part of their strategy, and it didn't. Nowhere stopped the care homes in the end. And they also have a Somali population, a ethnic in Stockholm, where 60% of their deaths come from. And a big amount of those are Somalis long-term in Sweden. Now, of course, back to our earlier conversation, the Black community in the northern after the winter, we're seeing 3x, 4x higher COVID impacts. Part of it's metabolic syndrome and maybe not being as healthy, but also we know they're profoundly deficient in general because of their skin color in the northern climes, especially now coming out of a winter. So there's all these factors, but Sweden's in the middle of the pack. And I just saw a publication yesterday, and guess what? Their R number was brought down below 1 to 0.84, which is amazing, a couple of weeks ago. So people are all talking about, oh, they have more deaths. But to be honest, all that matters is the R number. And if the same R number as Germany and England and a lot of them who did lockdowns. So people are not seeing the full science and the natural curve that viruses follow. They're not seeing that there was a massive spread of this before March, before even distancing started, never mind lockdown. They're not seeing the big picture. And the media, of course, 99.9999999% are not seeing the big picture at all. It's sad, but they're journalists. I suppose, how could they possibly understand complex science?
It's tough, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
not their job really. Their job is to
No.
get views and clicks. But
Yeah.
if you could recap some of this stuff a little bit, I don't know if you have any more slides on this or not, but just the fact that I've listened to some other podcasts, watched YouTube about these curves where you can look at all the different curves And
Mm.
you can look at the lockdown measures in all the different countries and then see, like you said, that the viruses have a natural progression. They have a rise and a fall, right? We know we can model them. And all these different countries did lockdown measures at different times. But what this data showed that I saw was that it didn't affect the number of cases, right? Because they happen at different times. And you can tell.
You can tell from the data, not with perfection, but the only people who are analyzing that data, multiple professors, including Nobel Prize winners, Stanford, Oxford, everyone of repute who's analyzed it says the same thing. So I'll briefly say Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine did the analysis with his team for the UK data, and he said it. He said the curve and the R number, which you need to get to 1 ideally, down from 3, everywhere gets a 3R at the start because the virus behaves like that. And you want to get it to 1. Now, it's going to go to 1 anyway, but you want to speed it to 1. So social distancing, it appears, got it to 1 before the lockdown kicked in. And after the lockdown, if you account for the lag, it kind of just stayed at 1. So the Koch Institute in Germany did the analysis for the German government, and their analysis says the same thing. Interestingly, China, by the time that they got to phase 4 and 5, which was lockdown, their R was already down at 1, and it didn't drop much more, really. Italy data pretty much says the same thing. Irish data given by the Irish government shows the R value down at 1 before the lockdown kicked in, and then it stayed there. So I could go on. Israel, an Israeli professor did the analysis, and he looked at all of Europe, and he said this is true for all countries. The lockdowns didn't change the shift of the curve. Distancing did, yeah, but not lockdowns. They didn't add anything. And in fact, Israel, I think they're following their own professor because they had the toughest lockdown of all for 5 weeks. And on Monday, the Israeli prime minister reversed the lockdown. Not 100%, but they're opening all businesses. They've said that people are free to travel wherever they want now. Kids can visit their grandparents again, and we know the grandparents are the ones at risk, but they say, no, you can visit your grandparents. And they're holding back on gyms and swimming pools for another week. But otherwise, they've reversed the lockdown. Now, how can you reverse a lockdown if it did something while the virus is clearly still prevalent in your population with an R of 1? The only way you can drop a lockdown as a prime minister is if you realize that it's not going to hurt, because it never really changed the R value much at all. So I think Israel are ahead of the curve here. Sweden are way ahead of the curve because they have an R value below 1, even though they never locked down. And I think it's going to be fascinating, Brian, if everyone who's done the analysis says the same thing. So far, they are. It'll be interesting to see, will that actually get in the media in the coming weeks, or will they not want to cover it?
Yeah. Can you quickly explain just the R value of 1, just in layman's terms? So, yeah.
Yeah, so the R value of this virus is very high, and it's kind of the R0, and it means at the start of a virus when it's spreading, how many people will an infected person generally infect? So it's how quick it spreads. So the R for this was around 3, and they've recently said they think early on it may be up to 5. The flu is 1.3. And because it's an exponential thing, the flu is way less spreadable than this, miles less. So how they ever thought that this would not, with cases in December and January in Europe and UK, how this wouldn't by March be everywhere, I don't know how they even thought that. But anyway, so that's the R starting off, 1 person infecting 3, and then it's just growing exponentially. But what happens then is, certain people die who are most susceptible, and the virus, a lot of people are asymptomatic and it passes and then they no longer spread. So over a month or 2, the R value naturally comes down. And I think really what happened is by distancing, you bring it down even faster. So that was smart in March, even though it was a bit late, it was smart. And then you want to get it to 1 because one means one person only gives it to one more person, and that means you're not going to have any really bad spread, really bad. But it looks like the distancing and the natural evolution of the virus got to 1 around March for most people. And when they did the lockdown, it stayed around 1. And I mean, Cuomo in New York has just said, since the lockdown, 66% of their new cases were from lockdown people who did stay at home and did not breach the lockdown. And he's scratching his head. And the reason is a virus follows its natural path. Distancing slows it. The lockdown, when it's a late lockdown, it just doesn't have anything left to give. So why they're not lifting it now is an extraordinary question, because they know they can do it safely with the hospitals now empty. And my heart goes out to the New York people. You know, they got a super spreader thing going on. The tubes were running, densely packed, high viral load. If you get more viral numbers into your body in your initial infection, your outcome may be much worse. So I think New York is a post-winter city, smoggy, ultra low vitamin D, minorities who are more exposed, and they did super spread in the tubes. So they got this massive cresting curve, and fair play to the medical people who were able to manage it. Tragic case. But New York can't be used as a model for the rest of the country, because you got Florida on a really light lockdown, and they got 10 times less death rate in an old population, and California. So, you know, I just think the policymakers just don't grasp the science. It's weird, but I'm lost. I've been lost for 6
Yeah.
weeks on this, Brian.
I think part of it is they don't grasp the science, and then they're scared to do anything because they're politicians. So there's this public consensus that we have to lock down. And so if they go against that, they're going to be screwed.
Well, that's just testament to the bravery of Sweden, who went against it when everyone else went with it. I mean, isn't that incredible to have the kahunas to do that? But there you go. Their intensive care, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, their intensive care reached a peak, and it's coming down, and they never got near their capacity. And their deaths are coming down, I think from around 10 or 12 days ago, they're coming down. And they basically did the job. They protected the hospitals. They're going to have probably, they guess, 25% herd infected in Stockholm now. And for this coronavirus, I was told by one virologist that coronaviruses generally, if you get to 25% exposed, they kind of begin to move on and go somewhere else. They'll go to the southern hemisphere for their winter. He made the joke, they bed and breakfast with us. But he said now, Ronoviruses or the other type, you need to get 85% infected to really make them move on. But apparently coronaviruses don't need a high percentage. So it looks like Sweden did a very good job, very tragic deaths, but they are in the middle of the pack in Europe. And their R value and their curves are, and the fact they never used anywhere near their ICU capacity are many measures that they did very well. But everyone wants to attack them. I don't know.
It's interesting. So to recap, we talked a lot of science, you talked a lot of, details, but tell the people the high level view of what goes on. Like if you lock down because it spreads so rapidly, because it's so infectious, if you lock down too late, all the damage has been done. Can you just give people kind of that picture? And then also the difference between lockdown and distancing. We're not saying you shouldn't protect the elderly or be safe. So just give the kind of wrap up here, right? And how we could have done it maybe.
Yeah, okay. And we were saying this back in early March, and I even did videos with Dave Feldman where I went through my lockdown, my smart distancing. So what I would have done much earlier, but let's say even in March, I would have done over 65s, really do quite a bit of isolation, because we already knew from China and Italy, that's who's at risk. So they need to be protected pretty well, even lockdownish, because you need to protect them. And care homes, my God, protect the care homes, because they're going to die 20, 30% per home once it gets in. So that's crucial. Over 55s, maybe with medical conditions, particularly diabetes, are a massive risk. they're at as much risk as a 75-year-old with no diabetes. So over 55s with actual diabetes, probably in the high risk group. Protect them, protect them, protect them. Under 55s or healthy under 65s, there's no point, because the impact is so low for those. You might as well let the virus spread so you can get herd immunity, which in turn will protect the older guys later and save lives. So it was an engineering, Pareto, separate and do the smart distancing. And then everyone, even in the younger healthy group, do the 6 feet, do the hands, the surfaces, absolutely smart distancing until we know this is past, and masks. They made a big mistake not just generally letting people wear bandanas, because there's a Japanese documentary with laser interferometry, which looked at when you're talking and laughing, and in a room, the 5-micron droplets go out and hang in the air. So I know they're not perfect, but if you're wearing a bandana or a mask and so is the other guy, you got 2 layers of weak protection, which you got for nothing. And of course, wash them or put them in the sun to make sure they don't gather virus, but that's common sense. So that was kind of smart distancing, target the people to protect, and then keep a slow curve for the ones who are not really going to be impacted using the smart measures. That's what I thought. But they didn't. They did a kind of a distancing all over, and it was softer than my version, almost. And then when the deaths started happening, which were inevitable because they were baked in from weeks before, they panicked and they did a full lockdown. But as we said, the data shows that adding a full lockdown, there's simply nothing really left to get from the scenario. It's not that a lockdown's really bad and does zero. It's just you would have got so much with the right smart distancing policy. You'd have been so successful with that in the way viruses behave that there would be nothing left to give for a lockdown. Mm-hmm. There's nothing left to give. And that's the way I viewed it now for 6 weeks. And in the last 3 weeks, we have all these professors analyzing the data and saying, well, actually, it looks like that's the way it was. Now, look, it might change. The virus might surge for some reason now. Something weird might happen. Never say never until a few weeks more have passed. But every bit of data, curve shape, and the analysis of top people in the field seems to be saying it's roughly as I'm summarizing it. I mean, I don't want to be right. This seems to be the technical scenario that is the reality. That's all. And the newspapers seem to be living in some, I don't know, crazy land or something. I don't know. They don't understand anything, I guess.
Well, and so we should say, you said Pareto, that's the 80-20 rule, right? Everyone knows about the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. And so we're talking about a lockdown, the difference between locking down the economy, which has caused trillions in damages, and the difference between smart social distancing that could have caused far less. So you're talking kind of like an engineering perspective on this, and that's what we should be talking about. And because you have to do a cost benefit analysis.
You do. And even without the cost benefit of the lockdown or the cost of the lockdown, even if the lockdown was pretty cheap, it still might not be the right thing to do, because it doesn't really offer more. But I can understand, like you said, Brian, in the fear and the panic, I can understand why you'd lock down. It's an instinctive thing, and no one wants to be wrong and have more deaths. So everyone just locks down. But now that the experts are coming out and the analysis is coming out, and it turns out, look, the lockdown didn't do much. You don't need to be too embarrassed. It was a good thing at the time to not take any chances. But now, with the data emerging and the R values, why aren't they more quickly reversing lockdown? A bit like Israel. You don't have to just dump the lockdown and say, did nothing. No. Why don't they rapidly? Like Ireland has a 4-month plan with the bars and cafes closed till September. And it's like, it just doesn't agree with any of the data. I mean, even if you're scared, it doesn't make any sense. Look at Israel. Sweden never locked down. Israel's just dropped nearly all the lockdown. I mean, other countries like Denmark have opened up the schools again. Germany's opened up. Some of them aren't even seeing an increase. back to our earlier point, the virus is following a trend. So you can drop the lockdown, you might not even see much. A dozen countries in Europe are reversing elements of their lockdown now. And maybe because England got so badly burnt, they don't feel that they can do that. They're just too scared. And Ireland was pretty bad too. And maybe, I don't know, I'm searching for the words, Brian. I'm musing. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic I've never seen in my lifetime. I have never seen crisis management done like this in my lifetime. And I've led a lot of crises with very complex causes and mathematics and lag times. I've never seen anything like this, where it appears people don't really want to look at the data to see if maybe we overshot, and they don't even seem to be interested. And maybe it's because the politicians, their population or their popularity ratings have soared. The people seem to like the holiday. They all feel like they're still saving lives, which feels great. And everything about this is good except the destroyed economy. And remember, no one's going to take the blame for the economy, because they're going to blame it on a small piece of RNA. And they're going to say, we're just keeping people safe and saving lives. So there's no incentive to do the right thing, do the analysis, and take a little risk, copy the smart guys, and pull back rapidly to get back on our feet. There isn't an incentive, perversely.
That's a good point.
This is tricky. It's a tricky one. They've painted themselves into a kind of corner, and it is a corner of fear. So they shouldn't be too proud about that, but they have. And America's got a lot of metabolic disease. New York, very, very tragic. And if American cities, northern, with a lot of metabolic disease, just stop measures, it could be really, really bad. So like you said, follow all the measures of your governments, your states, while still talking about the data. And one last point I'll make, I know we have to wrap up very soon, there's a deadline, but one thing that truly shocks me more than anything about this is the idea has got out, and it's a dangerous, dangerous conceit, a dangerous idea, and it's gotten widespread, that there's a new normal, that things won't be the same again. And I say, when this season passes, things might not be the same if it surges or comes back later next winter. Things might not be the same in 2024, or sorry, in 2024, if we have another virus that's tough. They might not be the same at any point in the future based on the data and the scenario. But I would say things must be the same as they always were, unless there's a crisis going on. And people are actually talking about a new normal. And that, for me, the human species now, because a severe coronavirus came in and came true, a lot of tragedy, have to give up what we've always done as a species. We have to give up some of our freedoms, some of our life. But why would that be? It's just scary.
It's really scary. Yeah, people are saying we're not going to have concerts anymore. We're not going to have movie. It is insane that it's like letting the terrorists win in 9/11 type of thing, right? We can't let the terrorists win. We already gave up so many freedoms, and it's such a bad ad. Yeah.
50 million people dead fighting for freedom. And now a virus comes along and may pass, and we've still been left with a new normal. I mean, what's happened us is what's happened us. I don't know. I don't understand.
Well, also, I want to throw in one more thing just to make sure I get it out there. Is I talked about the economy and trillions of dollars. That's one thing, but I'm talking about the deaths too. I'm not trying to say like there's so many people that die. We know we have data that show when the economic downturns, there's more deaths, there's more suicides, there's way more repercussions than just money. There's actual deaths. So I'm not just saying, I don't care about money. I'm not like some economy money person.
No,
I don't care.
I don't care.
I'm talking about deaths.
Care about the money. And I'd agree, Brian. It really doesn't mean much to me. I'm kind of self-employed. I have my own thing going. The economy will recover at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I feel terribly sad for the artisan farmers and people I know in Ireland whose businesses are ruined. I feel very sad for all the other people whose lives are ruined economically, but it doesn't affect me. It's not what I'm about. I agree with you. It's about all the collateral death, all the heart attacks that happened, cancers that didn't get treated, hospitals that couldn't be used for months will build up an enormous backlog of excess mortality, suicide, you know, even offenses against like women and everything. Apparently there's a load of phone calls have risen for violence in the home, children who missed their education, difficult homes for having the kids not at school can cause a lot of extra collateral damage. I could go on all night. These are human impacts of huge import. But you know the problem, Brian? The blood's invisible. No one's going to have responsibility for that. They'll only have responsibility right now, it appears, for corona deaths.
Mm-hmm.
No one will ever carry the can for the much bigger human misery and impact down the road, because they'll just say, well, we were saving lives and this is just the price that has to be paid. Next. And that's tragic. And that's a bottomless pit of bad leadership. Sorry, you got to say it. Because real leaders, can you imagine what FDR would have done in this? I mean, the 1968 flu was worse than this. I don't think there's any question about that. And Woodstock went ahead, and the moon landings, Nixon, Vietnam was the focus. And I saw one article where it got the third page of the paper. There was a really bad flu going around. A lot of older people were getting hit. Now, maybe they were callous, but it's a perspective. And 1957 flu epidemic, way worse than this. And it killed people below 15 years of age. A big tail of young people died. And they were wearing masks and everything. But I mean, they had to get ahead with life. So I don't know. What the world is an unusual place now. So anyway, that's my last word. But a great point, Brian. This is not about the economy. Money is just money. They'll print more paper money. Yeah, we'll pay more tax. The only money problem with this, or economic, is the failed businesses, depression and suicides relating to miserable lives. It's the human side of the economy and all the death and suffering that's collateral damage. You're right. That's the problem. It's not the economy. It's not my shares. I don't care. I don't even own shares. It's nothing to do with it.
Nothing. I'm with you. I'm self-employed. I have no skin in the game. So also, you mentioned cancer. So I just want to bring this. I wish I had this data in front of me, but there's a usual amount of cancers that get diagnosed each month, by this time of the year. And it was something, 60,000, and we're something like only 5,000, right? So because people can't get in the hospital and do this, we're not diagnosing tens of thousands of cancers. And this was just one step. I don't know what this was. Sorry, I didn't bring it with me, but it's just to illustrate this point of the unintended consequences.
It's dizzying, and it's kind of depressing actually, because the politicians don't even want to talk about it. The papers, the media aren't even interested. I mean, how can you trust the media when they just don't care about all that death and suffering? They only care about corona right now. Yeah, corona's going on now, but we know the curve's gone up. We know it's coming down. I showed the European data. It's going to be much worse than 18. We can't possibly say now, but the way the curves are going, maybe 2.5 times worse. It's a big deal. But everyone's just completely obsessed with that. We might come back in a couple of weeks, circle back and maybe answer it.
Yeah. Maybe we're completely wrong. Maybe in a couple.
Could be.
Well, let's wrap this up. This was so great. Thank you for coming on and sharing this information. Again, I'll say, check out the YouTube version. Check out Ivor's YouTube, Fat Emperor. Where else are you? You're at Fat Emperor. Is that your usual handle?
Oh, I'd say Google Ivor Cummins, my name, and you'll see my YouTube, fatemperor.com, and Facebook, Twitter. And the other thing, though, as well, we have a new movie out. So a part of me being supported is we've invested in a movie on heart disease. We scanned 45 guys in their 50s who were sporting heroes in 1991 in Ireland, real characters. And we find a load of them with massive disease, even though they were all said to be perfectly healthy by their doctors. Several have had to have multiple bypasses, and one had an event just before they were able to give the bypass, but he was okay. So the calcium scan to find out if you have an issue at middle age. And we also follow one of the heroes who said, I want to beat this. So he does all the stuff that we would talk about, and we scan him again a year later. And let's just say, it's not a sad story. It's a triumphant story. So if people could go to extratimemovie.com, if you could put the link there, it's from Donal O'Neill's Serial Killers. People might know him. Great movie, and it really helped us. Stream it for $3.99. Download and own for $9.99. But please also share it with people. It gives you the answer to stopping heart disease progression and a lot of entertainment as well. So that'd be great. Really support us.
Absolutely. I'd love to support that. And that's really important because kind of the story you're talking about is people, ex-athletes who thought they were healthy and didn't realize that they actually weren't. The CAC score is huge. And it's just a huge message that why is fueling me, right? Why I'm making Food Lies is because I thought I was healthy. I thought my parents were healthy and we weren't, right? This is the biggest problem, is that people, even if I was semi in shape, right? And I thought I was fine, but that is not always the case. And so that's a great movie, great message. I'll share it. And thank you so much.
Great stuff, Brian. Catch you next time. Bye now.
Bye.
Another one is in the books. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope everyone is doing well and getting vitamin D and getting their immune system up and eating ancestral foods and eating a sapien diet and doing all these good things. You can go to sapien.org and find out about all that's going on, about the health technology, the Nose to Tail, Peak Human podcast, Food Lies movie, and join the newsletter for Sapien that comes out every once in a while and has valuable information. Discounts sometimes for Nose to Tail, and hopefully some events in the near future if events are ever allowed again. Thanks again for sharing with family and friends, giving a review on iTunes, and we'll see you next week.